Saturday Arvo, the auctioneer's barking, the crowd's dead silent, and a bloke in high-vis is watching his whole bloody empire burn. One rate shock, one busted contract, and the dream turns toxic, fast. Kerry Packer said it best. Of course I am minimizing my tax. In Australia, everyone loves the hack, the shortcut, the structure, the clever angle. But tonight, you're about to watch 10 people confuse a loophole for a strategy and get their heads kicked in by debt, by the RBA, by the ATO, and by the coldest truth in this country. When the bubble bursts, nobody stays clean. This isn't one collapse, it's a chain reaction. A builder, a mom and dad investor couple, a renter, a cafe owner, a tax accountant, an agent, a software engineer, a bank risk boss, a super fund manager, and a woman right out on the edge who never even touched the game, but still gets flattened by it. 10 stories, one system, one giant Australian delusion. And when it goes suburb by suburb, room by room, soul by soul. Liam, 45, tradie, builder, bloke everyone reckoned had it sorted. Steel caps by dawn, ute in the driveway, contracts rolling in, a handshake like concrete. In the boom, he was the face of working-class aspiration gone turbo. He didn't just build houses anymore. He built the fantasy. And after a while, he started believing the fantasy was about him. Not luck, not cheap money, not the sugar hit of low rates. Genius. Pure genius. Everywhere Liam looked, the market was screaming the same filthy message. Why build wealth slowly when you can lever it? He saw Sydney prices, Melbourne prices, Queensland spillover. He heard brokers talking serviceability, saw mates unlock equity like a poker trick, watched paper gains turn average blokes into insufferable profits. So he crossed the line. He stopped being the man who built homes and became the man who hoarded them. One property, then another, then another. Every purchase justified by the same national bedtime story. Property doubles every 10 years, mate. By the time the cheap AUD flood had every punter drunk, Liam was signing fixed-price contracts with the swagger of a bloke who thought the laws of economics had been canceled just for him. Clients loved him. Banks loved him. Suppliers tolerated him because cash still moved. He'd stand over a slab at 7 a.m., coffee in one hand, phone in the other, talking like a mini developer. He had the sunnies, the ute, the watch, the war chest of ego. And under all of it, maximum leverage, tight margins, zero room to breathe. Then the trap snapped shut. Hard. Timber surged, steel surged, freight surged. Labor got smashed. Every fixed-price contract Liam had signed in the sugar rush years turned into a bleeding wound. The numbers didn't wobble, they turned feral. Every job that looked profitable on paper became a slow suicide in steel caps. The client still wanted the house. The supplier still wanted cash. The crew still needed wages on Thursday. But the profit? Gone. Every build was now a loss disguised as momentum. And while the company was copping hammer blows, the other knife slid in from the dark. The mortgage cliff. Those lovely little fixed-rate years ended, and the RBA started pushing rates high enough to separate men from delusions. Repayments exploded. The same loans that once felt manageable suddenly looked psychotic. Liam wasn't just holding a busted business now. He was carrying overpriced property bought at the top, financed on assumptions that belonged to a dead world. He had 2 fires burning at once. Construction losses on one side, personal debt on the other. This is how collapse really looks in Australia. Not one dramatic bang, but paper cuts until you bleed out. BAS statements. Supplier demands. Payroll panic. Missed calls at 6:12 a.m. Emails marked urgent. Clients asking when the keys are coming. Liam still rocked up in the ute. Still barked orders. Still pretended the site was under control. But behind the high-vis bravado, he was dragging money from one account to another, like a bloke carrying buckets out of a sinking boat. Not making wealth, not even preserving it, just delaying the moment everyone else would smell the blood. Then came the letter, "No operator wants to see." Administrators, liquidation. The construction sector collapse stopped being a headline and became his office, his staff, his name, his disgrace. Half-finished homes sat exposed under gray sky, while clients kept paying mortgages on buildings that were never getting finished on time. One of those clients was Chloe. Another was Jack. They weren't just disappointed customers. They were the next dominoes, standing in wet grass, staring at frames Liam could no longer afford to complete. Liam tried to save himself the way Australians always try to save themselves: sell an asset, move some debt, stretch the story, bluff one more quarter. Saturday auction. Agent smiling, auctioneer calling, plastic chairs, cold crowd, no bids, passed in. That's when the humiliation lands, not when the numbers go bad, but when the market you worship publicly refuses to validate your lie. The portfolio wasn't wealth, it was toxic stock. And the bank, which had once clapped him along, now wanted repayment plans, evidence, and an orderly path to the slaughterhouse. And just when Liam thought he'd hit the floor, the fluorescent light clicks on, and the ATO starts sniffing around. Structures, deductions, losses, timing. He'd spent years minimizing tax on profits that, in truth, only existed because the bubble kept reflating his ego. Now the debt remained, but the profit had vanished like smoke. The ute, the watch, the property chat, the alpha tradie swagger. It all looked different under audit light. Less empire, more costume. In the end, Liam doesn't explode. He dissolves. Tools sold. Crew scattered. Marriage strained. Reputation cooked. He stands inside a damp, half-built shell and hears the next wave coming. Because collapse in this country is never private. Chloe and Jack inherit the carcass, their unfinished homes, their mortgage repayments, their tax strategy, their negative gearing fantasy. Liam thought he was the protagonist. He was just the first corpse in the chain. Chloe and Jack were 38, classic Australian mum and dad investors. The kind of couple who didn't see themselves as speculators because that word sounded dirty. No, they were building wealth, securing the future, getting ahead for the kids. They heard the same line at family dinners, inspections, finance podcasts, and over cheap red wine with friends who'd made paper millions doing absolutely nothing. Property doubles every 10 years. Property is safe. Property is culture. Property is the religion. They weren't villains. That's what makes it brutal. They were believers. They had jobs, routines, school runs, a spreadsheet on the fridge, and a polite little desperation to not be left behind. Then came the sales pitch every Australian middle-class couple gets force-fed the second they've got a heartbeat and a half-decent combined income. Use equity, buy the next one, let the tenant help with the mortgage, use negative gearing to your advantage, and don't worry about short-term pain, because the long-term capital growth will make you look like geniuses. That wasn't advice. It was cultural hypnosis. Liam was their builder. Or meant to be. They'd signed up for homes that existed in brochures, in renders, in promises, in time frames that sounded reasonable back when fuel, materials, labor, and sanity still obeyed some rough law of gravity. Then Liam's world imploded, and Chloe and Jack were left standing in front of half-finished houses, paying full mortgage repayments on structures that couldn't shelter a dog. Concrete slab, framing, exposed wrap flapping in the wind. Progress payments already gone. Builder gone. Certainty gone. And because the Australian property machine never lets one mistake travel alone, their tax strategy turned cannibalistic at the exact same moment. Negative gearing only feels clever when rates are tame, prices are rising, and the loss looks like a controlled sacrifice in exchange for future glory. But when the RBA keeps punching, and the market stalls, and the holding cost goes savage, that strategy mutates. It stops being optimization. It becomes self-harm with an accountant's vocabulary. Every month, Chloe and Jack weren't positioning for growth. They were burning cash to defend a myth. So they did what drowning investors do. They pushed pain downstream. They looked at their tenant, Ethan, not as a human bloke trying to survive, but as a valve, a pressure point, a way to claw back some oxygen. Rent went up, then up again. They told themselves it was justified. Everyone else was doing it. Costs had risen, interest had risen, insurance had risen, the market had changed. But beneath all that rational language was the ugliest truth in Australian housing. When the leveraged class starts panicking, the renter gets skinned first. At night, Chloe and Jack sat in a kitchen lit by laptop glow, refreshing numbers that never got friendlier. Holding costs, vacancy risk, insolvency risk, completion costs for Liam's unfinished builds. Quotes from replacement tradies that looked like ransom demands. Mark, their tax accountant, kept speaking in tidy categories. Deductible loss, cash flow management, portfolio positioning, ride the cycle. But deep down, the couple could feel something rotting. This wasn't a cycle anymore. This was a trap. They hadn't bought freedom. They'd bought obligation at scale. The romance went first. That's always how these stories go. One partner says, stay the course. The other says, get out. One wants to believe the market always comes back. The other starts looking at the kids and thinking, maybe stability matters more than the fantasy of becoming mini landlords with a coastal holiday home one day. Chloe and Jack stopped talking like a team and started talking like litigants. Every sentence became blame and activewear. Who wanted the second property? Who pushed the leverage? Who trusted Liam? Who trusted Mark? Who kept saying property never fails in Australia? Then the market humiliated them properly. Listings piled up. Buyer confidence thinned out. Open homes felt weird. Agents started using softer words with harder eyes. The unfinished assets were poison. The completed ones weren't performing. The tax relief was no longer comfort. It was evidence of how much blood they were losing. And Ethan, the tenant they'd squeezed, was running out of room to bleed for them. That's the sick beauty of this system. People like Chloe and Jack don't realize they're victims and perpetrators at the same time until the entire thing is chewing on their bones. By the end, the myth is dead. Property does not save them. Negative gearing does not save them. Respectability does not save them. They are left holding mortgages on dreams built out of momentum and political religion. And the pressure they shoved onto Ethan? It travels. Because when a landlord starts thrashing, the renter's life turns into a bidding war, a survival contest, a weekly humiliation. Chloe and Jack thought they were securing the future. They were just passing the panic to the bloke renting the roof. Ethan, 29, mining engineer. On paper, he was meant to be untouchable. Smart, qualified, hardworking, decent salary, remote site hours. The kind of young Australian professional the system loves to parade around as proof that the deal still works. Study hard, get the degree, work like an animal, and you'll be fine. That's the lie. Not that hard work never matters. But that hard work protects you from a rigged asset market. It doesn't. Not when housing becomes a feeding frenzy and shelter turns into an auction. Ethan rented from Chloe and Jack. At first, it was manageable. Not easy, not generous, but manageable. Then their world started collapsing, and his rent became their damage control mechanism. Increased notice. Then, another. Emails dressed in polite language that carried all the softness of a crowbar. The excuse was always market conditions, rising costs, necessary adjustments. Ethan knew what that meant. He wasn't paying for his own shelter anymore. He was subsidizing the panic of leveraged investors above him in the chain. Then the market got even uglier. The rent bidding wars. That grotesque Australian ritual where people line up in clean shirts and forced smiles, praying a property manager picks them as if they're begging for sponsorship. Ethan found himself doing things he never imagined, offering above ask before inspection, front-loading rent, trimming every part of his life just to stay competitive in a market that treated basic shelter like a luxury good. Hundreds of dollars over the listed price. Not for a view, not for prestige, just to not end up with boxes in a mate's garage. You can watch a bloke's dignity erode in stages. First he gives up eating out, then small travel, then hobbies, then any illusion of spontaneity, then sleep. Ethan still put on the boots, still flew to site, still did the job. But the private life was being ground into paste by rent. Every increase wasn't just a number, it was an extraction of blood from the future. Saving for a home deposit? Finished. Building a buffer? Finished. Planning a life? Finished. In a nation obsessed with property, Ethan became a high-income pauper, earning well, owning nothing, and getting outbid for permission to exist. He believed in the system for too long. That's his sin. Not greed. Faith. Faith that if you worked enough, earned enough, and kept your head down, the market would eventually reward you. But the market wasn't designed to reward him. It was designed to milk him. Every weekend inspection, every bland rental listing, every agent smirk, every unfortunately on this occasion email taught the same lesson. Ethan wasn't participating in the economy. He was being strip-mined by it. Then Sarah's cafe starts noticing blokes like Ethan disappearing. Fewer takeaway coffees. Fewer bacon and egg rolls. Fewer quick lunches on the way to work. Because when renters get squeezed hard enough, local spending dies first. Ethan isn't just a tenant. He's cash flow in human form. And now that cash flow is being funneled straight into somebody else's collapsing portfolio. The cafe owner doesn't know his name yet, but she can feel his absence in the till. The cruelty is that Ethan does everything society asked of him and still ends up living like a fugitive from comfort. He starts calculating food by the week, not the meal. Starts avoiding certain streets because they're lined with real estate posters that feel like taunts. Starts looking at share houses again, like he's 19. Starts wondering whether the mine salary is even a blessing anymore, if all it does is make him a more attractive target for rent extraction. That's the Australian rental market in full bloom. It doesn't just take your money, it rewires your nervous system. At some point, the bidding war wins. Ethan gets a place, but at a number so stupid it feels violent. He signs not out of confidence, but exhaustion. He has beaten other desperate people for the privilege of financial depletion. And once the lease begins, he realizes the victory is fake. The rent devours so much of his income that his life narrows to work and recovery. No margin, no joy, no runway. And Sarah, serving fewer customers each week, is about to learn the same lesson from the other side of the counter. Ethan thought the threat was unemployment, or bad luck, or personal failure. It wasn't. It was systemic extraction. A housing culture so diseased, it turns educated workers into prey. He never speculated, never leveraged, never gamed the tax code. Yet he still gets smashed because every bubble needs a human base layer to absorb the pressure. Chloe and Jack push down. Ethan caves in. Sarah loses his coffee order. The domino keeps moving. Sarah, 42, cafe owner in Melbourne. Sharp, quick, presentable. The kind of woman who could make a room feel busier than it was just by moving fast enough. Her cafe looked good from the outside. Clean branding, polished machine, that thin illusion of urban prosperity Australians love to photograph and misunderstand. But beneath the polished cups and exposed brick was the old disease of modern small business. Debt, thin margins, image maintenance, and a private terror that one slow season could break the whole thing in half. Sarah's customers used to arrive like clockwork. Tradies, office workers, engineers, blokes like Ethan with decent wages and enough leftover cash to buy coffee without thinking. Then the pressure started hitting households, rents, mortgages, groceries, repayments. And the first thing to die was the casual spend. Not dramatically. Quietly. One less muffin. One less second coffee. One fewer lunch order. Then whole faces vanished. Ethan still passed through the city, but not the cafe. He couldn't afford habits anymore, and Sarah still began telling the truth before anyone else would. Like so many Australians, Sarah loved the look of wealth more than the plumbing of it. Nice fit out, good suburb. Home financed on assumptions from a friendlier rate era. A life that looked healthy in photos and brittle in private. Her accountant, Mark, had sold her some tidy logic about structuring, deductions, property positioning, smart debt, efficient tax outcomes. She nodded along because everybody in this country wants to sound switched on about money, even when they're building their life out of glass. And now the glass was cracking from every direction. Cafe costs rose. Utilities rose. Supplies rose. Household repayments rose. Customer spend fell. That's the pincer. It doesn't come at you from one side. It crushes from both. Sarah tried all the usual fixes. Roster cuts, menu tweaks, supplier fights, longer hours, smaller portions dressed up as artisan elegance. None of it touched the central problem. There was less money in the room, less confidence, less waste. Her business wasn't failing because she forgot how to run a cafe. It was failing because the whole economic atmosphere had turned poisonous. Then came the move that feels unthinkable until it doesn't. The superannuation raid. In Australia, super is meant to be sacred. Future money, old age protection, a fence against the indignity of becoming poor after a lifetime of work. But when the house is on fire, people start ripping the timber out of the future to keep the present warm. Sarah pulled from super under hardship provisions because the bank was closing in, the mortgage was snarling, and the cafe couldn't carry both the business and the household anymore. That's not planning. That's cannibalism with paperwork. She sits there staring at the transfer confirmation, realizing what has just happened. Years of compulsory retirement savings gone into a hole that keeps widening. The brutal genius of the Australian system is that it can make a person feel both responsible and helpless at the exact same time. Sarah blames herself for the lifestyle, the signaling, the softness toward appearances. But what really killed her was a culture that taught everyone to fake resilience through leverage and optimism. She didn't spend recklessly like some cartoon fool. She just believed the surface of prosperity was the same thing as actual safety. And while Sarah is liquidating the future to survive the month, Mark, the tax accountant who helped normalize all of this, starts feeling heat of his own. Because every tidy little wealth strategy sounds brilliant when clients are climbing. When they're gasping, those same strategies start looking like a paper fortress in a bushfire. Negative gearing, tax offsets, investment deductibility. He sold elegance. The system delivered panic. Sarah becomes one more client whose cash flow snaps in public, and that means one more stress fracture running straight back into Mark's office. The house doesn't feel like a home anymore. It feels like collateral with family photos in it. That's the sentence nobody says out loud in Australian suburbia. Sarah starts hearing the word arrears, like a pulse in the wall. She still opens the cafe, still smiles, still froths milk, still asks customers how they are. But behind every friendly interaction is the knowledge that her retirement has already been partially sacrificed just to stop the bank from eating the present. She isn't living, she is stalling. By the end, Sarah understands something savage. Poverty in a rich country often arrives wearing expensive clothes. It arrives in a polished cafe, in a clean kitchen, in a woman who knows how to host and style and smile. It arrives by erosion. And once she raids super to survive, the liquidity she yanks from that system leaves another institution wobbling. James's fund. Another domino. Another hole punched into the story Australians tell themselves about being prudent, hardworking, and protected. Mark, 50, tax accountant. This is the bloke who always looks calm when everyone else is sweating. Crisp shirt, controlled language. The man who can make danger sound deductible. He'd built a career speaking fluent Australian aspiration, negative gearing, trusts, offsets, structuring, portfolio logic, tax efficiency, holding costs, long-term capital growth. To clients like Sarah, Chloe, and Jack, Mark wasn't just an accountant. He was a priest of financial legitimacy. If Mark said it was smart, then it felt respectable. That's power. And power turns poisonous when it confuses legality with invincibility. Mark loved cleverness. Loved the feeling of being the bloke who knew where the seams were in the system. Kerry Packer's line, "Minimize tax, don't donate extra to a government that spends badly," wasn't just a quote to him, it was a worldview. Why pay more than you must? Why leave money on the table? Why not use every rule, every allowance, every structure? On its own, that instinct isn't madness. But in Australia, clever tax behavior often gets stapled to stupid asset behavior. Mark didn't just minimize tax, he gradually started minimizing respect for risk. He advised Chloe and Jack through their property logic. He helped Sarah think she was making strategic choices, not just decorating a debt problem with adult vocabulary. And of course, like so many professionals who mistake proximity to money for mastery of it, he built his own little empire too. Investment properties, debt structures, offsets, some shares, some private arrangements. Enough moving parts to make him feel sophisticated. Enough leverage to make him vulnerable. His portfolio looked diversified on paper. But under stress, it was really one giant bet on confidence staying alive. Then the client started wobbling. Sarah's cash flow snapped. Chloe and Jack's unfinished builds became sinkholes. Liam collapsed. Rent extraction turned ugly. Suddenly, Mark's calm office started filling with people whose tidy assumptions were now foaming at the mouth. They didn't come to optimize anymore. They came to survive. They wanted certainty. Mark had tax language. They needed oxygen. And beneath his professional mask, he knew the truth. They weren't facing a mere paperwork problem. They were standing in front of a macro firestorm, dressed up as personal finance. Then, the ATO letter lands. That white envelope, that fluorescent chill. Audit, review, verification. Suddenly, all the elegant structures, all the soft confidence around deductions and timing and losses, all the little strategies that seem so civilized in the boom. They look fragile. Mark knows the difference between legal planning and aggressive overreach. He also knows the difference between being right in principle and surviving scrutiny under pressure. And what terrifies him most isn't just the tax risk, it's what the audit light reveals about the rest of his life. He isn't liquid, he isn't safe, he's exquisitely exposed. This is where the accountant's curse bites. Mark can read the numbers before anyone else. He can see the cracks traveling through balance sheets, through housing valuations, through serviceability, through confidence itself. He knows his own net worth is part fiction. He knows some of those valuations were never money, just mood. He knows a few deductions saved some cash at the margin, while the debt mountain behind them became monstrous. And he knows the clients who trusted him are about to associate his name not with prudence, but with the very architecture of their pain. When Olivia, the real estate agent who sold some of these investment dreams, starts losing listings and commissions, Mark recognizes the same disease in a different suit. She sold momentum. He rationalized it. Liam built into it. Chloe and Jack borrowed into it. Sarah dressed it up. Ethan bled under it. That's what a bubble really is. Not one bad bet, but a social ecosystem where everybody has a role in keeping the delusion alive until reality shows up with bolt cutters. Mark still walks into the office in polished shoes. Still says things like cash flow compression and portfolio resilience and contingent exposure. But the language doesn't protect him anymore. The ATO notice is the cleanest mirror he's seen in years. He realizes he didn't build safety, he built complexity. And complexity feels luxurious in the good years, until stress arrives and every moving part becomes another place for the machine to seize. He thought he was the bloke gaming the rules. Turns out he was just another punter standing on a paper bridge. By the time he opens his own spreadsheets at night, the room feels smaller. Less like command, more like confession. He can no longer pretend the nation's property religion is a rational allocation strategy. It is mass psychology, backed by tax incentives, political cowardice, and cultural vanity. Mark spent years translating that madness into respectable accounting language. Now the language is collapsing with the rest of it. And Olivia, staring into empty open houses, is about to discover what happens when there's no buyer left to sell the dream to. Olivia, 35, real estate agent. Sharp suit, white smile. Phone glued to the hand. The human interface between fantasy and contract. In the boom, Olivia was a queen of momentum. She didn't sell houses, she sold urgency, she sold scarcity, she sold status. She sold the sensation that if you didn't buy this weekend, you were a fool who'd be priced out of civilization forever. Investors like Chloe and Jack, perfect clients. Guys like Mark, easy money. Olivia knew exactly how to make speculation feel like prudence and panic feel like sophistication. She believed her own theater. That's the rot. After years of hot weekends, packed inspections, and effortless commission, Olivia stopped seeing herself as a passenger in a manic market and started thinking she had actual market genius. Every campaign that moved fast became proof of her instinct. Every buyer overpaying became proof of her brilliance. That's phase one madness in a bubble. Micro-paranoia turned into performance. You stopped noticing the tide because everyone's busy complimenting your surfing. She sold portfolios that should never have been pitched as security. She nudged people toward leveraged confidence because it paid. Not in a mustache-twirling comic book way, in the smooth, respectable Australian way. Get in now. Long-term hold. Strong fundamentals. Rental demand is robust. This suburb's only going one way. The phrases came out polished because she'd said them 1,000 times, and because in a rising market, repetition feels like truth. Mark loved the efficiency. Chloe and Jack loved the legitimacy. Olivia loved the commission split. Then the freeze came. Not a dramatic Hollywood collapse. Worse. Silence. Fewer calls. Fewer registered bidders. Fewer emotional buyers. More hesitant sellers. More inventory hanging around too long. And then, the most humiliating sight in the industry. An open house inspection with no one turning up. Olivia stands there in the polished living room of an overpriced investment unit, shoes silent on engineered timber, brochure stack untouched, and feels a level of panic she's never known. No crowd means no illusion. No illusion means the pricing story is dead. Income for agents looks glamorous in the boom because commission feels endless until it disappears almost overnight. Olivia's not salaried in any meaningful protective sense. Her life runs on momentum, listing flow, office churn, personal brand, optimism, and a market willing to validate the performance. Once that validation stops, every cost in her own life starts looking predatory. Car payment, rent or mortgage, wardrobe, marketing spend, lifestyle creep disguised as professional necessity. The entire machine had trained her to spend like the future was guaranteed. Now the future won't even return a phone call. This is where Noah comes in, the software engineer who provided CRM services to Olivia's office. In the boom, technology vendors are part of the celebration. Every agency wants lead funnels, automation, data tracking, sleek follow-up sequences, all the little digital systems that make a property office feel like a war room. But when the market locks up, those contracts get cut fast. Olivia's office slashes costs, trims staff, drops external services, and Noah loses one of the clients he counted on. Another domino. Another nervous system entering shock because Olivia can't sell a fantasy to an empty room. The real damage to Olivia isn't just financial, it's existential. She built an identity around being the woman who could move stock, stir emotion, manufacture urgency, and surf the market's appetite. Now she's learning the appetite wasn't permanent. She wasn't a rainmaker. She was a beneficiary of cheap money and collective delusion. That's a hard revelation to swallow when your industry trained you to believe every win was personal excellence. The empty open house is more than a bad day. It's a mirror, and the mirror is merciless. She starts feeling fear in physical terms. Tight chest, dry mouth. The weird silence after a scheduled inspection time passes, and the front door remains untouched. She refreshes the agency CRM, stares at lead counts like a doctor watching heart rhythm flatten. The market isn't dead everywhere, but it's dead enough to destroy certainty. And certainty was the only product Olivia truly knew how to sell. When that goes, she's just another overextended Australian professional with branded clothes and an unbranded panic. By the end, Olivia understands a nasty truth about property culture. Agents are never just sellers. They are emotional engineers. They train the public how to feel about risk. For years, she taught people that hesitation was weakness and buying was maturity. Now her own hesitation is screaming. The office cuts contracts. Noah gets clipped. And the same system that once crowned Olivia with easy money now leaves her standing in a bright, empty room, wondering whether the whole industry was just a retail face on a national addiction. Noah, 28, software engineer. Smart kid, not flashy. The textbook modern Australian professional, good degree, decent income, productive, reliable. The sort of person adults point at when they say the system still rewards discipline. He did what every institution told him to do. Study, build skills, get employed. Save. Buy carefully. Think long-term. Don't be reckless. Don't be stupid. Noah followed the script so closely, it should have guaranteed him a clean future. Instead, it delivered him to the altar of debt with a polite little smile. He serviced businesses like Olivia's office with CRM systems, automation, software maintenance, digital plumbing. Not glamorous, but solid. The kind of income stream you think can weather turbulence because businesses always need systems, right? Wrong. When the property machine jams, anything attached to the machine starts losing limbs. Olivia's office cut the contract as soon as listings dried up and fear entered management meetings. Noah lost income not because he failed at his job, but because he was tethered to a sector whose confidence had been built on fumes. At the same time, Noah had made the responsible move. He bought, not a mansion, not a casino-style speculation, just a home bought under the old cultural promise that ownership equals adulthood, discipline, and security. He stretched, sure, but almost everyone stretches now because wages and prices stopped living on the same planet years ago. The bank signed off. The numbers were serviceable. He wasn't being reckless. He was being Australian. That's the punchline. The system normalizes risk until ordinary compliance becomes extremism in disguise. Then, the rate pain bites. The contract loss hits. The buffer shrinks. And Noah has one of those moments that can snap a human being in half. He looks at the debt statement and realizes the number sitting on the page exceeds what his total lifetime income might ever feel like in real, spendable terms. Not the abstract salary projections. Not the heroic best-case spreadsheet. Actual life. Actual energy. Actual years. The note is bigger than his story. That's when financial stress stops being arithmetic and becomes spiritual suffocation. He can't easily sell because the market's gone soft and transaction costs are brutal. He can't easily refinance because income uncertainty kills flexibility. He can't simply work harder because that's not how debt math works once rates and cash flow turn hostile. This is the horror of the modern respectable trap. You do not need to be foolish to be crushed. You just need to obey the timing of the bubble. Noah isn't a speculator. He's a disciplined kid who bought into a culture that weaponized adulthood against him. And here's the bitter thread. One of the people who approved loans like his, who normalized this level of leverage as acceptable, sat inside the banking system calling it prudent risk. Isabella. Credit risk executive. The sort of powerful adult who signs off on broad lending exposure while speaking the language of control, governance, settings, oversight. Noah is on the ground with the statement in his hand. Isabella is in the tower with the policy deck, yet both are about to be hit by the same macro sledgehammer. Noah starts stripping his life for parts. Subscriptions gone. Travel gone. Social life gone. Then any soft purchase that once made the workload feel worth it. He's not budgeting anymore. He's rationing identity. The flat he bought no longer feels like a milestone. It feels like a vault he has been locked inside. Every bill is a reminder that ownership in Australia often means being privately conscripted into servicing a giant national fiction about rising asset values. He owns the keys, but the debt owns the breathing space. What makes Noah's story savage is its moral cleanliness. There's no obvious vice to blame. No nightclub stupidity. No flamboyant greed. No sports car idiocy. Just a smart, decent worker trapped by a system that turns aspiration into liability through timing, policy, and mass overvaluation. That's why these collapses are so psychologically devastating. If a person like Noah can do nearly everything right and still end up staring into a financial void, then the whole mythology of merit starts looking like a bad joke. By the end, the fear is no longer, can I make next month work? It's, how many years of my life have already been claimed by a number that does not care whether I remain human? Olivia's office moved on. The contract is gone. The bank remains. And above him, Isabella, the woman from the risk side of the fortress, is learning that the fortress itself was made of dry timber. Isabella, 55. Bank credit risk executive. This is where the story climbs into the tower and shows you the machine from above. Isabella wasn't some reckless retail borrower. She was establishment, governance, committee papers, internal memos, approval frameworks, stress tests, lending settings. The polished face of institutional control. She helped oversee the very logic that made loans to people like Liam and Noah look acceptable. Not because she was stupid, but because the whole banking culture had been trained to mistake a long boom for proof of permanent safety. In the good years, risk doesn't feel like risk. It feels like margin. Growth, market share, lending expansion, competitive positioning, management confidence. The metrics look stable because the tide is doing all the heavy lifting. That's how empires rot from the inside. They start treating tail risk like a rounding error. Isabella signed off on exposure settings, approved aggressive lending pathways, watched leveraged products and borderline serviceability cases slide through under the soft glow of a market everyone assumed would stay structurally supported. She thought she was managing the beast. Really, she was feeding it. Then the RBA turned savage. Cash rate up, funding costs up, borrower stress up, defaults whispering, then speaking, then shouting. Loans that looked fine in committee suddenly began misbehaving in the wild. Construction exposure turned filthy. Households on the mortgage cliff started gasping. Software workers like Noah lost contract income. Builders like Liam went down. Investment stocks softened. Revaluations bit harder. Isabella watched the dashboard change color like a control room in a disaster film. The data no longer looked like a temporary wobble. It looked like contamination. What destroys people at her level isn't just money, it's narrative collapse. Isabella had believed the institution was the adult in the room. That stress testing and policy sophistication insulated her from the mess facing the borrowers. But the borrowers are the bank's bloodstream. When enough of them start choking, the institution's own body changes. Pressure from above, scrutiny from shareholders. Political heat, internal blame, tightening standards too late, denying risk too long. She starts understanding that prudent lending in a bubble often just means respectable acceleration toward a cliff. And then the personal blow lands. Because like so many senior professionals who mistake career success for invulnerability, Isabella also built her own life on the assumptions of the era. Investments, property, assets that seemed lawful, conservative, grown up. She didn't gamble in the cartoon sense. She simply believed the same system she governed would remain legible, gradual, containable. But when the rate shift becomes punitive and the repricing gets vicious, her own balance sheet starts taking on water. Legal wealth, clean wealth, high-status wealth. Still mortal, she sits in boardrooms hearing words like impairment, provisioning, delinquency migration, portfolio deterioration. Cold terms. But each of those words points at a real human collapse somewhere below. Liam's failed company. Noah's existential debt panic. Chloe and Jack's unfinished assets. Sarah's super withdrawal. And one day she looks at the macro settings and realizes something terrifying. What's punishing the borrowers is now reaching back into the people who designed the conditions. The machine doesn't care whether you ran it. Once it turns, it grinds operator and victim together. Then comes James, the super fund manager dealing with liquidity stress as people raid retirement savings in desperation. Another institution under pressure because households are bleeding. Isabella sees the link immediately. Housing stress isn't just housing stress. It mutates into super stress, consumer stress, credit stress, political stress. That's the hallmark of a real unwinding. The collapse becomes ecosystemic. You don't get 10 separate tragedies. You get one massive transfer of pain rippling through every layer of supposedly modern, supposedly prudent Australia. The brutality for Isabella is reputational before it is material. A risk executive can survive a downturn. Harder to survive the knowledge that the discipline you represented was partly theatrical. The models did not fail because numbers are evil. They failed because the social assumptions beneath them were rotten. We'd normalized impossible house prices, central bank dependence, leverage worship, and political cowardice around supply and tax distortion. Isabella's spreadsheets sat on top of that swamp and called it measurable. By the end, she understands the deepest insult in finance. Being technically competent inside a fundamentally diseased system does not save you. It only gives you a cleaner vocabulary for describing your own exposure. The RBA shift strips borrowers, then lenders, then the funds. James is next, holding paperwork colder than weather, about to issue legal notices into a country that still thinks bubbles only hurt the reckless. James, 60, Superfund manager. Calm voice. Gray suit, long horizon thinking. The custodian type. In theory, he represents one of the few sane ideas left in Australian finance. Patient money, retirement protection, managed prudence, a buffer between working life and old age humiliation. But theory gets mauled when the whole country starts ripping money out of the future to survive the present. Sarah's superannuation raid wasn't just her private tragedy. To James, multiplied across thousands of stressed households, it was a liquidity event with teeth. He began noticing the pattern in the flows. Hardship withdrawals, emergency access pressure, asset sales becoming less orderly, cash management tightening. At first, it looked manageable. Then, it looked widespread. Then, it looked like a slow run on confidence. That's the thing about super in Australia. It feels untouchable until people discover they're desperate enough to touch it. When households begin eating tomorrow to survive today, funds like James's aren't just administrators anymore. They become shock absorbers for a social failure far bigger than any individual investment strategy. James prided himself on long-term discipline. But long-term discipline gets ugly when short-term panic forces liquidation. You don't want to sell quality assets under pressure. You don't want to meet cash demands in a sour market. You don't want to explain to members that their future security is now tangled up in a present-tense property unwind that nobody in Canberra ever had the guts to confront properly. Yet there he was, managing flows, protecting solvency, trying to keep faith with people whose faith in everything else had already shattered. And because the economy is a chain, not a set of silos, James's stress intersects with property defaults. Mortgages fail. Investment assets underperform. Lenders move. Distressed disposals accelerate. Funds and legal teams become part of the machinery that turns private anxiety into formal consequence. This is where the paperwork gets cold. Default notice. Breach notice. Recovery pathway. Possession proceedings. James didn't start his career dreaming of being the man who helps formalize hardship. But when the liquidity dries up and obligations bite, morality gets replaced by process. One of those processes touches Mia. She's not an investor, not leveraged, not a balance sheet acrobat. Just an office worker renting a home that sits somewhere downstream of all this institutional pressure. But when assets get seized, refinanced, sold, liquidated, or restructured, tenants become movable pieces on somebody else's board. James knows this. That's what makes his role so corrosive. He can feel the human cost of the documents long before the documents are issued. Yet the machine requires signatures. Timing, sequence, enforcement. Humanity comes last. There's a particularly cruel loneliness to James's position. Everyone below him sees a suit, a fund, an institution, a faceless enforcer. Everyone above him sees an operator responsible for liquidity and compliance. Very few people see the moral nausea of sitting inside a lawful process that converts mass distress into tidy files. He knows Sarah wasn't raiding super for fun. He knows borrowers didn't all become stupid at once. He knows the housing cult, the tax incentives, the rate settings, the social pressure The scarcity narratives, all of it built the conditions for the panic now pouring through his desk. Still, the notices go out. That is how systems preserve themselves. Not with speeches, but with forms. A default notice is one of the coldest documents in modern life because it translates the chaos of a person's circumstances into a neat administrative trigger. Missed payment, non-compliance, remedy required. Failing which? Action. James signs where required, or authorizes where required, and feels the dissonance between retirement stewardship and participation in a wider asset cleansing event. The law is orderly. The consequences are savage. He starts thinking about the national mythology again. Australians like to believe superannuation made them prudent, that compulsory saving turned a country of punters into a country of long-range planners. But what happens when the same country builds a housing market so distorted that people raid their retirement just to stop the present swallowing them whole? Then the super system isn't a shield. It becomes another reservoir to be drained in crisis. James realizes the structure wasn't as stable as it looked. It was merely another layer of delayed vulnerability. By the time Mia's situation lands on the desk in practical terms, recovery, possession, tenant displacement, James has already seen the whole chain. Liam's collapse. Chloe and Jack's squeeze. Ethan's depletion, Sarah's raid. Mark's audit panic. Olivia's freeze. Noah's debt suffocation. Isabella's institutional reckoning. And now the outer ring. The person who never even got a seat at the table. That's the final obscenity of a bubble bursting in Australia. It doesn't stop at the gamblers. It hunts down the bystanders. Mia, 32, office worker. She is the person this country loves to ignore when it talks about wealth. Not because she's insignificant, but because she doesn't fit the mythology. She's not flipping houses, not maximizing deductions, not leveraging equity, not bragging about the portfolio. She works, pays rent, tries to keep life moving, and lives in the blast radius of decisions made by people with more assets and more jargon than her. She is the outer ring victim, and in every real crash, the outer ring gets hit last. And hardest. Mia rents an apartment that, to her, is simply home. A place to sleep, reset, live. To the system, it is an asset line item inside a wider chain of obligations, securities, covenants, arrears, and institutional responses. James's fund, under pressure from withdrawals and recovery actions, moves through the cold legal machinery of possession and liquidation. Mia doesn't experience any of that as elegant finance. She experiences it as a notice, an email, a phone call, a date on a page. Vacate, exit, end of lease security, asset transition. The language is clean. The effect is violent. She didn't cause Liam to over-leverage. She didn't tell Chloe and Jack to worship negative gearing. She didn't price gouge Ethan. She didn't raid Super. She didn't structure tax plays with Mark. She didn't sell fantasy with Olivia. She didn't lose a CRM contract like Noah. She didn't approve risky loans like Isabella. She didn't issue default pathways like James. Yet the full chain arrives at her front door anyway. That is the butterfly effect of asset collapse in a housing-obsessed nation. Every speculative sin eventually lands on somebody whose only crime was needing a roof. Mia's first response is disbelief. There must be some mistake, some way to explain, some human buffer in the system. But late-stage financial stress strips the human layer off institutions. People on the phone sound sympathetic but immovable, process-bound. She starts looking for new rentals at the exact moment the market is still brutal, still competitive, still humiliating. And because she doesn't have wealth behind her, every relocation cost feels catastrophic. Bond, moving, time off work, application scramble, the psychic damage of having your life turned into a spreadsheet emergency you never consented to. There's a special cruelty in being told to move during a housing crisis by a system that constantly lectures ordinary workers about personal responsibility. Mia has been responsible. That's the point. She budgeted. She turned up. She didn't gamble. But none of that matters when shelter has been transformed into a downstream effect of high-level financial self-preservation. She stands in another rental queue, clutching documents, competing with strangers for basic stability, and realizes the market does not reward virtue. It rewards position, and she has none. What Liam saw at the auction, what Chloe and Jack felt in the unfinished build, what Ethan felt in the bidding war, what Sarah felt in the super withdrawal, what Mark felt under ATO light, what Olivia felt in the empty open house, what Noah felt in the debt statement, what Isabella felt in the risk reports, what James felt in the default notices. Mia feels all of it in one concentrated flash. Not as theory, as homelessness pressure, as dislocation, as the sudden understanding that in Australia, property is not just an asset class. It is a social weapon. She packs boxes in a flat that no longer feels neutral. Every object becomes heavier because it's being moved under coercion. The kettle, the books, the office clothes, the little ordinary artifacts of a life. This is how the national obsession with wealth finally reveals its ugliest face. It can turn a working woman's private routine into collateral damage without ever making the nightly news. There is no auctioneer here, no dramatic boardroom, just tape on cardboard, panic in the chest, and the low-grade shame this country loves to attach to anyone losing ground, even when the ground was rigged from the start. Mia is the final proof that no one escapes the system when the asset bubble collapses. Not the builders, not the investors, not the renters, not the professionals, not the institutions, not the ordinary worker who never once mistook tax minimization for genius or leverage for destiny. Once the machine breaks, it sends shrapnel through every layer, and the last people hit are often the ones who had the least protection, the least voice, and the least to do with the original madness. So when Kerry Packer says, "Of course I am minimizing my tax," the real lesson isn't some cheap celebration of greed. It's this: know the game you're in. Know where the incentives point. Know who gets protected. Know who gets fed to the machine. These 10 people thought they could ride the system, trust the system, outsmart the system, or simply survive inside it. Instead, the system revealed what it really was: a national house of debt, dressed up as prosperity, waiting for the moment the lights flicker and the whole bloody thing comes down. That's the Australian nightmare. Not one villain, not one mistake, not one bad borrower. Chain, a suburb, a culture. A lie told so often it became policy, and then became pain. 10 lives, 10 collapses, one market, one country. And when the bill finally lands, everyone pays.